Ladies and gentlemen, this is Pakistan's number one football show, Pressing Matters, brought to you by On the Mic. I am Ismail Farooq, and with me is no one other than Bilal Mumtaz, who was here previously in wearing a very different hat. And this is a guy who wears many different hats, and one of them is that he is a football fanatic, an avid football fan. He is actually a Valencia fan in Pakistan, which is probably the one and only. But yeah, I'm Bilal. Thank you so much for coming back on the show, and I'm looking forward to this. Looking forward to talking football with you. Did you enjoy the Euros, the ones that recently happened?
I did, actually. I tried my best to follow all the games.
And which team were you supporting?
I've always supported La Furia Roja, which is better known as the Spanish national team, even though I was quite impressed with the progress they had made this time round. I wasn't expecting them to actually make the semis, but they did.
And no one is expecting them to make waves, because I think ever since 2012 and after that, their decline after the golden generation, so to speak, went away. No one really expected Enrique to do much with this squad because it wasn't packed with a lot of talent, compared to the teams of the past. But I think the collective really shone, especially with players like Olmo and Pedri, who performed way better than people maybe expected. What do you think about Italy, man? I mean, Italy were the dark horses. I actually know a friend who, even before a ball had been kicked, told me that Italy's going to win it. Mark my words, and that's what happened.
You know, I see a lot of reminiscence from the 2006 World Cup, where Italian football, as you know, went through the Calciopoli scandal and Juventus got relegated, and a lot of players from other clubs were also under heavy scrutiny because of this. So that was an example of how they overcame a dark time and ended up coming on top in the World Cup. Yes, they had great players back then as well. You're talking about Del Piero and Cannavaro and Ernesto and Pirlo especially, and a great manager. So in this time, right, we have to go back to when they were essentially knocked out by Sweden in the playoff qualification round leading up to the World Cup. And, I actually ended up seeing a video on this at Costa Curta. Needed a lot of help on how they could basically employ a more pressing type of football, because they were complaining that Immobile and a few other players who were supposed to be immense attackers were playing in their own half in the return leg that ended up 0-0, that ended up, crashing them out. So then Mancini, took up that challenge, and it's so amazing that he actually had a coaching staff under him that were all part of the Scudetto winning Sampdoria side, including Gianluca Vialli, of course. And I did see them play with a lot of good team chemistry, even though really, I think unless you follow football, there weren't really any superstars in that team.
Absolutely.
Maybe Chiellini.
That's what I was going to say, that usually it might have been that they had a lot of players back from Juventus or one of the top teams. But this time was more of a unit, and it was especially great because usually throughout the national, I mean, you know this as well, throughout the national tournaments that have gone on in the past, either that's the World Cup or the Euros, you have all these different countries who have a distinct style of play, who have some different footballing philosophy. So Italians have always been more of a defensive sort of game where they are tight at the back. That's what they're known for. Then the Dutch are known for total football, different sort of stuff. But this time we saw Italy win the Euros with a style that was more like the Dutch. They were actually playing positional football, with a high pressing, like you said, game. And that was really impressive to see, and how Mancini did it really quickly. So let's move on to I think we should talk about the history of the Euros, because not many people know the great transformations or the great stories that have taken place in this tournament over the years. What can you tell us about how the Euro started and the subsequent tournaments that happened?
Sure. So basically, for the first 20 years of the European Championships, which were even then quadrennial, meaning they were held every 4 years, the final tournament would be held in a particular nation, and 4 teams would make the final tournament. So you'd have semifinals and then essentially final, and
it's like
a third place playoff.
UEFA Nations League right now. It's this sort of the same thing.
In a way,
yeah,
you could say that. So in 1960, actually, Spain dropped out of the tournament, and you had USSR, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and France play the final tournament. So it was held in France, but France bowed out of the semifinals, and then USSR ended up winning. And I think the one person that people associate the USSR team with was Lev Yashin, who's a legendary goalkeeper. And the next edition, it was held on Spanish soil, and Spain definitively won. 68 was a similar story with the Italians. It was held in Italian soil with the same 4-team format. In 1972, it was held in Germany, and this is where you saw actually the roots being planted for a really great German team with the likes of Beckenbauer and Müller. And a lot of other great players. 1976 was an interesting tournament because what you saw was the Germans facing the Czechoslovaks in the final. The tournament itself was held in Yugoslavia. And the Czechs, or the Czechoslovaks, actually, to be more politically correct, had a striker called Antoni Panenka. And he was actually tasked with scoring the goal that would actually give the trophy.
And this was the last final decided on penalties, and like before the 2021, the recent one that happened, right?
Yeah. And what we saw was his penalty kick, which was actually a chip that was, kicked to the center of the goal, would forever be immortalized as the Panenka penalty.
Yeah.
And so that's what a lot of people emulated. And this was, I think, one of the first tournaments where actually some games were decided on penalties, because I believe in 1968, when Italy and the USSR were in a semifinal, Italy actually, held them to a draw after 90 minutes and extra time. And it was through a coin toss that they actually got to the final. So that's another interesting fact. 1980 was a very, very important tournament because with the research I've done, 3 monumental things happened. Number one, if you were decided to be the host country of the Euro Championships from there on in, you would automatically qualify for the final tournament. And then you had a transformation where it would be an 8-team tournament instead of a 4-team tournament. So you had 2 groups of 4 teams each. And this was actually the last tournament where a third place playoff was going to be played. So this also was a tournament that was held in Italy, second time after 1968. Germany ended up winning. But the main vocal point about that tournament in particular was the third place playoff between a disheartened Italy side and a Czechoslovakian team that ended up beating them 9-8 on penalties. So it was there undecided, right, that because the third place playoff, happened in those circumstances where it was the host nation playing the third place playoff, there wasn't a lot of, attendees at the stadium. Even, the broadcasters weren't too keen on covering it. No one really cared. And so after that, the third place playoff was scratched. 1984 was undoubtedly the tournament of Platini, because that was a tournament in which he scored 9 goals in 5 games. It was held on French soil, and France duly beat Spain in the final.
Yeah, I mean, that is known as the Platini tournament, that 1984 Euros, and then Maradona obviously shown.
That was the exact point that I was going to make. So there are only 2 footballing tournaments at the international level that have been credited to a single footballer for winning that tournament for the particular team.
There was 6 goals or something in that.
9 goals in 5 games.
That's actually crazy.
So one example was obviously Maradona in 1986, and the other example would be Platini in 1984.
I think he won the Ballon d'Or that year. Because he won it twice or thrice. He won it multiple times. And then obviously we move on, and 1996 is the time when it gets to 16 teams, and it's for the first time called the Euros, because it was actually called the European Championships. Before that, like the European Cup is now known as the UEFA Champions League. But before that, I just want to talk about the 1992 European Championships, which was I think, the sort of tournament that you're not going to see again. The story, at least, of what happened. Why don't you fill us in on what happened in that tournament?
So this was a very particular time in history when the Soviet Union had broken up. So you could say an entity known as the CIS, the Commonwealth of Independent States, took part in that tournament in lieu of Russia. This was the first tournament where a unified Germany would be playing for the first time ever. They would basically take the guys of West Germany in previous tournaments. And in the case of Yugoslavia, because they had recently broken up, they were essentially disqualified from taking part in the tournament. So if you talk
they had
about
a civil war going on.
Yeah. So if you talk about the country that ended up winning that particular Euro, Denmark, they weren't even supposed to take part in the final tournament. They literally
actually lost to Yugoslavia. They came second behind them.
Yeah. And then you had essentially like a great team. Obviously, Peter Schmeichel. There's a Henrik Larsson, that team, not to be confused with the Swedish Henrik Larsson, who ended up being top scorer of the tournament. And they did, very essentially well in their group. Where
so sorry to cut you off. You know which I think needs to be caveated here when we're talking about the squad. So the first thing obviously is that they were sort of last minute entries as a replacement. The Danish league had only finished 5 days ago. Some players were on holiday. A lot of players were actually on holiday. And they had a 3-day training camp or something. And it was just like, even the coach said, it was like, okay, 3 losses and then we're back, just khana puri karne ja rahe hain. And then the most amazing thing, which when I found out, I was like, damn. You're talking about Peter Schmeichel and Henrik Larsson, the Denmark one. Michael Laudrup wasn't in the squad.
He wasn't.
Brian
Laudrup was.
Yeah, Michael Laudrup, who is obviously the best Danish player ever, who is one of the best playmakers of all time. The last true number 10, some people say. He wasn't in the squad. He had a falling out with the coach. And yet, please continue what happened.
So what happened was that Denmark ended up being placed in a very tough group. They had England, Sweden, and France. And France, even at that time, had the great Jean-Michel Papin, who's, I believe playing for AC Milan at the time. So what happened was they drew with England. They lost to Sweden, but they managed to beat a French team that was actually favorites for the tournament. So they ended up coming second in the group, but they still had the daunting task of facing the Netherlands in the semifinals. And that was a game that essentially went to penalties. And the one iconic moment, if you look at any videos from that penalty shootout, is when the particular Dane who scored the winning penalty completed his kick and scored, and they were through the finals. He did like a dance where he twirled around in just like one position with his hands up like this. And they beat, and I think it needs to be said that the Dutch side that they beat were the ones that have won. They were the defending champions who won 1988. The team of Van Basten, of Bergkamp, Gullit, with Rijkaard, with all of those players. That was the Dutch golden generation. And this team of shoo-ins, basically, that's what they were at the time, just beat them in the semi-finals of the European Championships. And then they went on to the final. Yeah. In the final, they beat a German side comprehensively 2-0.
Do you think that's the best ever story? Because we've seen the Greece story, we've seen the Russia story, we've seen Iceland. Do you think this is the best one?
I'd say it would be, because if you talk about the Greek team, they were playing in some of the best leagues in Europe at the time. You're talking about Angelo Charisteas, Angelo Bachanas, Theodoros Zagorakis, and even the goalie as well had a lot of experience. And Otto Rehhagel, of course, was a German coach who had a lot of experience playing in the Bundesliga. Yes, it has to be noted that they were 150-1 outsiders for winning the tournament beforehand. But I think that they played a very stubborn brand of football, and they kind of had the talent to do it. Yeah. They're already playing in some of the best leagues, and I think they just needed a motivating force in their coach.
Generally, I think 2004 was a weird year for the European football in general, because even in the Euros and the Champions League, a lot of the top teams got knocked out early.
Yeah, Porto ended up winning the Champions League.
Porto, I think, played Deportivo La Coruña, and all the big teams like Porto, I think, beat Real Madrid, and a couple of other big teams lost as well. So the final was
Real Madrid was actually beaten by Monaco.
Oh yeah,
by Morientes scoring those goals.
And then Monaco played Porto. Yeah. And then that's how it happened. And then in the Euros, it was Portugal versus Greece, and all the big guns had sort of gotten out early. So that was, I don't know if it's a coincidence or something happened in that particular year. I don't know.
It was a freak year, yeah.
Yeah, and then obviously let's move on to 2008, which was the Russian story, even though it didn't win. Obviously, now we look back on it, we talk about Spain, and that was the start of Spain being Spain as we knew it. Xavi won the player of the tournament. Fernando Torres burst onto the scene, and that was the first time I had seen a national team actually dominate a national tournament to such an extent, because I think out of 11 players, 9 Spanish players made the team of the tournament, which was sort of freaky. Mm-hmm. But I think the thing that we need to talk about is Russia, because they qualified above England, and you know how the English are. They were talking about how they've sort of
Croatia was in that group too.
Yeah, Croatia and Russia
Yeah.
qualified, and they were sort of crying about their own selves and not looking at how Russia was doing. But what do you think about that Russia team?
So, since Russia were placed in the same group as Spain, and I had been following all Spain's games in that tournament, I, saw a very resolute side that Spain played against in the first game in the group stage. So this was the game where David Villa scored a hat-trick and it was 4-1. And then, you saw the Russians beat Greece later on. But then again, there was all this talk about how this particular footballer called Andrei Arshavin had missed the first two games and that Spain should get embraced for him if they ever face Russia again. So in the last game, Russia ended up beating Sweden with Arshavin in the squad, and then they ended up making the quarters, where they beat a very, reputable Netherlands side as well.
No, I think that was in the semis, no?
No, in the semis they beat Spain.
Yeah, they got beat in the semis. They made the semis. You're right. Yeah, I think they beat them 3-1 in extra time. And that was the Andrei Arshavin match, so to speak.
That was.
Yeah, and that's when he also completed his move to Arsenal later on.
Yeah.
I want to talk about Arshavin for a bit. You obviously follow football during that time period. He's a weird player in the sense that he burst on the scene like crazy. Like as we saw in the Euros and then in the Premier League. I remember as a Liverpool fan, he scored 4 at Anfield to deny us the title. That was a crazy game, 4-4. And then a few years later, he just sort of disappeared. Do you know what happened? How did he just become so good in a short span of time and then just sort of disappear? Because that doesn't often happen. Either obviously you see a decline in a player, but it's very rarely that a player just sort of falls off a cliff completely and then just goes.
So you see this happen with a lot of players who move to the Premier League. I think the demands of that league are quite high. Even if somebody, like the main reason as to why you see decline is injuries. And to my knowledge, Arshavin had gone through his fair share of injuries. Another Arsenal player that I can sort of reference who also went through a decline during his time where there was Thomas Ruzicki, who was absolutely great for Dortmund before. And then he played very sparingly and sporadically during his tenure over there. But that's essentially my 2 cents about Arshavin. I know, and I do remember quite, fondly his performance against Barcelona 2011 Champions League, where Arsenal won the first leg against them in the round of 16.
And Wilshere was in that team. That was a good Arsenal team.
Yeah, but they ended up losing later on. So he did put in some good performances for Arsenal.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's what I'm saying. He was great for Arsenal for a few years. Like, I think 2000, like right after Euros up till 2011 and 12, he was great. And then he just sort of, maybe it was injuries, maybe it was something else. He just sort of disappeared, and then we didn't hear. We just knew Arshavin used to be there, and then he was just gone, sort of. So I don't know what happened there. But yeah, I think generally from 2008 up till maybe 2016, the Euros, jo beech mein ek hua. I think 2012 was not the best tournament. Maybe I think the thing that I remember most from it is the Balotelli celebration.
After Germany.
Yeah,
the semi-finals.
The semi-finals. But I don't find that a very memorable tournament. Spain being Spain as usual, and that's what happened. But I want to talk about 2016.
Okay.
And obviously the story from that time was, again, at the peril of England. There was a team that won against them, and it is after, I think, because they didn't win the entire tournament. It's not maybe the story of Denmark, but it is one of the heroic stories, which I think happened right after Leicester won the Premier League. So I think that was the era of underdogs or something. So what do you think about how Iceland came? I think that was the first tournament with 24 teams, so that's how they made it.
Yeah.
And they sort of, I think, proved that they belong there.
Yeah, I remember that game quite fondly, and I do recall there being an Icelandic player who was playing for Leicester City at the time. It was part of the title-winning squad. The thing about England for the longest time is that they've always boasted great talent. And if you want to know about why the golden generation didn't probably perform at the level that they should have, is that there was no team chemistry among the players. So every time, they would go to a tournament and they would get done with training or their games, they wouldn't communicate with each other.
Yeah.
So
they are different leagues based on clubs.
Essentially. And so you found like a resolute Icelandic squad that ended up beating them comprehensively. Like they scored early on and then they defended to the last. And then they had that Viking celebration.
England scored first, right? Yeah,
Yeah, I
England scored a
believe
penalty first, and then
they
they
did.
came back.
It was 2-1 to
Yeah,
Iceland.
yeah.
And at the end, they went in front of their fans and they did that whole Viking clap, which ironically France did in the quarterfinal after they beat Iceland. So they're there with their own French fans, which is kind of slap in the face.
And Iceland, I don't know if people know, they have a population of, can you guess?
A population of?
How many people are in Iceland?
So I know that Reykjavik is like the most populous city there, which is the capital. I think that's only got 30,000. So maybe 50 or 60,000 people.
No, I mean, that would be pretty low if it's only 50, 60,000.
Okay.
It's around 300,000.
All right.
But 300,000 is like, for people who don't know, Lahore is probably between 5 to 10 million people.
Right.
Karachi is around 20 million. So this country has 300,000, excuse me, 300,000 people. And obviously for people, I mean, it's kind of obvious, but the more people you have, the bigger talent pool you could possibly have. I think that's why Croatia was such a good story as well. They have a pretty low population as well, and it's also a general indictment of us as a country. We're the sixth most populous, I think, in the world, and we're nowhere near in sports. But yeah, it was crazy how that happened. But I think after that they've sort of like I don't know, ebbed away or something. Did you follow them for this Euros or qualification? How far did they go?
I don't think they made the final tournament.
No, they didn't. So that's what I was asking.
I wasn't really following the qualifications this time
right.
around, actually.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, cool. So, I mean, generally, these have been more or less the best stories that we've seen in the Euros.
Mhm.
What changes would you like to see in a European tournament moving forward? Have you ever thought of this? I mean, are you fine with the 24 team thing? Do you like the 16 one? Which way are you leaning?
So I like the 24 team format. Even if you look at, how countries are qualifying, it's not just the fact that 24 teams make the final tournament. The four, you could say, semi-finalists from the nation leagues also get into the final tournament. This allowed for teams like North Macedonia to come in, which, people...
For the first time
ever.
And it was a crazy stat. The Goran Pandev at 37 years old is North Macedonia's youngest ever goal scorer. I mean, just to play with words. So
Yeah, that is funny.
He's their only goal scorer.
And then Hungary came in, and, I'd like to definitely see more teams.
Hungary was actually good. There's this I can't pronounce his name.
Zoltan Jeha.
No. I can't do it. It's the player that went to Leipzig recently. Sazlo Blai or something of the sort.
All right, yeah.
Total apologies there. I don't know how to pronounce his name, but he was pretty, like, I'm pretty excited by him. But generally, don't you think with the 24 team tournament, the concept of jeopardy doesn't apply that much? I mean, I might seem foolish saying this because we've had probably the best Euros I've seen. This one, I loved it. But generally, when you have three teams qualifying from each group, don't you think that makes it sort of, if you win one game, you're more or less, I mean, if you draw the other two, you're more or less set. Don't you think that's a problem? Should we only have two qualifying from group of four?
So it's not that the top three teams make it through, it's that the top two teams make it through, and the 4 of the 6 best performing third place teams go through.
Yeah, so 4 out of 6 is pretty much, bas 2 hi nahi ja rahi. So essentially it is 3 out of 4 for most of them. But 2 groups hain jinme it's 2
but
out
see,
of 4.
if that wasn't the case, then you wouldn't have, like the upset of France being decimated by, Switzerland in the penalty shootout. And it gives an opportunity for some of the smaller teams or the minnows of European football to prove themselves on the greater stage.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it makes the knockout part of the tournament really interesting.
Of course, yeah.
Do we have a Euro in 3 years now or 4?
I do believe it's going to be in 2024. I don't...
Yeah, so 3 years. I mean, because this was Euro 2020. I mean, that's how they packaged it.
It was still branded as Euro 2020,
right? That's what I meant. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, this has been great fun, Bilal. Chatting to you about the history of the European Championships. You're obviously very knowledgeable about football. I hope we can do another episode talking about your work in Chitral. Guys, this guy is doing a lot for Pakistani football because I think as you know, and people don't know, there are a lot of different hubs of football in Pakistan. There's one in Chitral, there's some in Gilgit-Baltistan, in the Makran coast, in Karachi, some areas, Liari, and different Malir, for example. These are different areas that have a lot of football culture. And Bilal basically organizes, and now I think is part of a team there, a football tournament in Chitral. I think this is a yearly thing. So yeah, I would love to talk to you about that and your own history as a Valencia fan and how that happened. But generally, this has been great fun. Thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been Pressing Matters. Do like, subscribe, watch our videos, and follow us on social media for more. Until next time, take it easy.